Alan, thank you very much indeed for those very kind words earlier. They're very much appreciated. And I'd like to welcome you all again to Brighton, to actually, for once, sunny Brighton. It's an unusual event, but it happens from time to time. Just by way briefly of introduction, I'm an energy economist by origin. I have worked on issues of technology transfer, especially around low carbon sources of energy to the developing world. I spent some of my early career working in Malawi and Nigeria, so although I don't have experience of Sudan, I have some experience of some African contexts. And I have tried to make this particular presentation relevant to at least two of the themes that Alan has set for this conference, and that is the role of universities and research institutes and issues of inclusion. And although the start of the presentation isn't directly about those things, it's what I'm hoping to work around when I get towards the end. Let me just get rid of that. Okay. I'm going to start, because this is really about energy, to question whether European ideas and basically industrialized country ideas about energy policy are or are not relevant to an African situation and possibly a Sudanese situation. In Europe, we have effective agreement now that there are three main legs of energy policy. One of them is the notion of energy security, which I'll come back to in a few moments. Secondly, there is the issue of environment. Sometimes that is reduced to climate change, as if that were the only environmental problem, though in my own view that is a narrow conception of what environment should be about in relation to the energy system. For example, in many developing countries, China is a classic example. There is terrible air pollution in cities. Some of the same policies that help city air pollution happen to help climate change, but they are distinct and different issues. And the third issue, not surprisingly, is the economic one, and that is the cost of energy and its affordability. I think, broadly speaking, for African countries, things may look somewhat different, though in some ways they are similar. First of all, security clearly matters, but we need to know what it is we're going to mean by security, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Secondly, access is critical. It's not just about cost and affordability, it's about whether large parts of African populations, especially those in rural areas, have any kind of physical access to modern energy services, and especially electricity, which has been a major focus of debates for at least 40 years in these areas. And I think there's a good deal of justifiable skepticism about whether environment should matter in quite the same way as it does to Europe or the United States in the context of Africa, unless there are acute local environmental problems. Because the difficulty with taking environment seriously, other than in the solution of local problems, is that generally speaking it makes things more expensive, and in countries that are relatively poor, that is usually a rather bad idea. So it's necessary to modify somewhat from that starting point notions of what energy policy might be about. Next question is, what does energy security consist of? I think for most people it consists of two different kinds of things that are not very clearly related. Many nation states, many governments conceptualize energy security as being something to do with minimizing their dependency on imported oil and sometimes gas. Ever since the first big oil crisis of 1973-74, a major concern, sometimes almost an obsessive concern, of industrialized country governments has been whether or not they can get access to oil, and where they're very import dependent, that can become very significant. Of course, much depends upon geography and indigenous resources. Some countries, of course, have a surplus of oil, others are deeply dependent on imports, and for a country like Sudan, there is clearly a great deal of oil, and the politics are very complex, but Sudan has the good fortune in some respects to at least have some availability of oil. The second definition of security, which, as I say, is often quite distinct and different, is something to do with, is the electricity system reliable? First of all, does it exist everywhere? And of course, for much of rural Africa, it doesn't exist, at least in the form of a grid. It may exist in novel forms in things like renewable energy technologies and traditional things like small-scale diesel generators, but on a mass basis, it doesn't. And of course, many electricity systems in the developing world are chronically unreliable. So in many developing countries in the world, electricity systems break down, sometimes on a daily basis and sometimes for relatively long periods of time. And that, as well as being immensely difficult at a personal and social level, is very unfriendly to the development of modern industrial and other commercial activities which clearly depend upon a reliable supply of electricity where it exists. And it means that for most developing countries, including most African countries, electricity is an absolutely critical political issue and is very much at the forefront of many debates of a political kind. I'm going to talk a little about energy security and oil. And I'll do this rather briefly. If a country has indigenous oil, then in principle there should be little problem in meeting my first definition of security, which is avoiding or minimizing dependence upon imports. And one of the reasons I'm raising it now in the context of this conference is that the domestic availability of oil may have implications for solving some of the problems of rural electrification. And I'll come on to why that might be so a little bit later on. There is, of course, a serious downside risk of having a very large oil sector. For countries like Nigeria, it has been very easy and very convenient to rely upon oil as the major, and now for Nigeria, almost the exclusive source of foreign exchange. There's virtually no other export from Nigeria except those things that come from the oil and gas sector. And people often talk about something called the resource curse, or in a European context, Dutch disease, which means that resources flow almost exclusively into this major hydrocarbon activity, oil or gas, and they flow away from all other activities. So if, for example, you look at the current situation in Nigeria, resources for agriculture have diminished very substantially. Agricultural output in Nigeria is now very low. Nigeria imports a very large amount of its own food, despite having the potential for growing much of it. And largely the reason for this is the dominance of oil in the economy and the reliance on the relatively easy revenue that can be raised through the export of oil. I don't think that's a situation in Sudan at the moment, but there is an issue about being over-dependent upon one particular source of energy. So let me now talk, as I want to, mainly, for the rest of the presentation, on questions of electricity, its availability and its reliability. As I've said, it's been an ongoing and very difficult area for most African countries for many years, and even in South Africa, which obviously is a richer country than many other sub-Saharan African countries, there have been major problems in recent years in the electricity system. Fundamental problem with electricity is, first of all, it's extremely expensive stuff. It's very, very capital intensive. For each output you get, you have an enormous level of capital inputs. And the other problem is that most African countries have to import virtually all of the capital equipment they use in their electricity system. But generally speaking, the electricity system doesn't generate foreign exchange. So there's an enormous need for foreign exchange to buy the equipment. And once you've bought it and it's installed, you don't generate foreign exchange because, generally speaking, it has to be sold domestically. And that's a major problem in terms of getting finance. And it has made electricity development in much of Africa very dependent upon donors and upon foreign aid. And that, unfortunately, for Africa, has undergone major changes in fashion over the last 30 or 40 years, including a very strong concentration in the late 1980s and 1990s from the World Bank and others on the notion that assets should be privatized and there should be an encouragement to inward private foreign investment, which might in principle have worked, but for most countries didn't. So the aid flows from public sources dried up, and there wasn't a corresponding inflow of private capital to compensate. So there has been a major problem, and for many African electricity systems, the problem is now chronic. Coming on to questions now of inclusion, and I'll come on to possible roles for universities and research institutes after that. Rural electrification levels are, generally speaking, very low throughout Africa. It's been a major and very legitimate political objective for at least the last half century to improve levels of rural electrification. The difficulty being that, in all countries, rural communities are much more expensive to provide with electricity because their populations are more dispersed. The length of distribution and transmission lines has to be a lot longer. And also it's the case that in general, rural incomes are lower than urban incomes. And so people's capacity to pay for electricity is less, and at the same time the cost of supplying them is more than if you live in an urban area. And that of course helps explain why electrification is much easier in urban areas than it is in the rural areas. There have been very fierce debates over at least 40 years about the relationship between electrification in rural areas and more general issues of economic development. There was a hope in the 1970s and 1980s that electrification alone would be a stimulus to very large improvements in the levels of development in rural areas. Regrettably, most of the evidence suggests that electrification is only a major stimulus to development if it is combined with a package of many other kinds of inputs. It's certainly true that rural electrification can help school performance if people can work in the evenings with lighting. It usually means, and there's pretty good evidence of this, that they can do better in their schooling. It's also true that people like watching television, and watching television is easier and cheaper if you're electrified than if you have to use car batteries, which is something that people use very frequently in rural Africa. So the economic impact on its own is not very great, but of course the political desire for electrification in rural areas remains very strong, because to be electrified is actually a ticket to participation in the contemporary world. And without electricity, it's extremely difficult to be a full participant in modern global society. So it is absolutely still the case that even if on its own, rural electrification doesn't do a great deal for development as traditionally understood, it remains politically and legitimately an extremely important area. So how can rural electrification be done? There are two main routes. The traditional route, which of course the big electric utilities always argue in favor of, and for perfectly good reasons, is to extend whatever grid exists from existing relatively large power stations to more and more distant communities. Problems with extending the grid is, first of all, some systems don't have enough generating capacity to generate more electricity for rural areas. It costs a great deal to build and extend transmission or distribution lines from urban centers to rural areas, and the question is, who is going to pay? Most African governments have been unable to afford rural grid connections to any very large extent. So one of the consequences of the industrialized world's interest in climate change has been a very rapid development in renewable energy. And one of the solutions that many aid agencies, and to some extent governments, the aid agencies have been more enthusiastic than governments, has been to develop decentralized renewable energy, and many donors have promoted and financed much of this rural electrification on a small, decentralized, standalone basis. Not without problems. If not subsidized, most renewable energy in rural areas is still very expensive. If it's in the form of things like solar home systems, the amount of power you can get from them is very low. It's fine for things like lighting, but it's not very good for rural industry or for pumping or for large agricultural uses. Unfortunately, most of the renewable energies used depend very much on the weather. So if it's wind power, it depends upon the wind. If it's solar photovoltaics, it depends upon the sun. And of course, you can add battery storage systems as well, but they are extremely expensive. So there are some disadvantages. And finally, and politically in some countries, people actually resist, quite legitimately, rural electrification by standalone renewable energy devices because they think it will give the national utility an excuse not to bother to send them the grid. So that if you begin to have a decentralized rural system, you're off the national agenda for being connected. And people have a long-term ambition that is perfectly reasonable to be connected to a large national power system. So there has been a political resistance of an understandable kind as well. But there is potentially some good news. The first is that renewable energy is very rapidly becoming very much cheaper than it ever was. Most spectacularly, solar photovoltaics are becoming cheaper at an extraordinarily rapid rate, largely thanks to mass production in China, which means that photovoltaic cells are now reliable, more efficient, and much cheaper than they were even only 10 years ago, and wind power as well, where relevant, is also getting quite a lot cheaper. Second development, which I think is very promising, is that people are beginning to experiment with, rather than simple standalone systems, with so-called mini-grids, where you can use a potentially diverse range of generating sources for a somewhat larger system, but still in a relatively small area, a village or a larger community. And this comes back to why having an indigenous supply of oil may be useful. Because given that wind and photovoltaics are very weather dependent, and sometimes they don't work, if you have a diesel generator as a backup system in a mini-grid, you can always switch the diesels on whenever the wind doesn't blow, or when it's dark at night and your system mainly depends on solar photovoltaics. So while for many countries that don't have domestic supplies of oil, diesel generators may or may not be a very good idea, for those countries potentially like Sudan, which do have indigenous oil, the notion of setting up mini-grid systems is actually quite powerful, because you can actually get a much more reliable supply provided you combine the diesel generation with the renewable generation. But still, mini-grids are still embryonic. They're still very difficult to fund. They're still very expensive, but they do offer one potentially very interesting route to electrification. So let me very briefly, I'm sorry we're running a little bit out of time, briefly come on to the implications of all this for the role of universities and research institutes. Well, it's clear that most of the relevant technology has to be imported. And this is no less true in some areas for a country like Britain. We have had quite a large increase in solar photovoltaic use in recent years. Something like 650,000 households now possess solar photovoltaic systems. We don't do any of the technology seriously here, we just buy it all from China. That's not likely to be very different in terms of the fundamental technology for African countries either, but there are very important issues of technology transfer. And work in SPRU over many years, pioneered by the founder of SPRU, Christopher Freeman, has dealt in questions of national systems of innovation, and in particular, in this context, the need to develop some sense of absorptive capacity on the part of the recipient country and its institutions. And it's fair to say that research bodies can play quite a large role in helping to develop capabilities to absorb and use technology in productive local contexts, especially by adaptation of technology. And this is a diagram that our colleague Martin Bell, who's now retired officially, but still seems as active as he ever was, developed some years ago to look at issues of how technology transfer may take place and how capabilities for innovation may emerge. And I won't spend very long on this. His interest was largely in this third flow C, knowledge and expertise behind the technology. It's unlikely that many African countries or many European countries are going to develop fundamental abilities to do solar photovoltaics at a basic level. But the very last thing I've said at the bottom, the adaptation of technologies to the domestic context is still a major issue in which universities and research institutes can play a large part. So the third flow, the need to adapt technology to local conditions, is very important. And what does this mean in the context of rural electricity? Well, there's a great deal of capacity to be built and learning to be done on subjects like what is the level of flexibility, what is the right scale, what is the potential cost, how can you engineer different system configurations in the host, the recipient country. And that needs lots of local engineers and economists. And there are very important roles for a wide range of social scientists in terms of saying how the technology should be used. Should it be at a household individual scale? Is it at a community scale? And how payment systems can be organized, because there are many different ways of organizing payments, whether or not a rationing system is used, and that is often true as well. And that's not something that donor communities are very good at. It's something that should be developed indigenously, largely in research institutions and universities, in order to ensure that you get the best kind of adaptation of the technology that is imported from elsewhere. And finally, in terms of the political question that people sometimes don't want local renewable energy because they fear they may never get the grid, China has come up with a very innovative solution. What it does is it simply installs things like wind power or solar photovoltaics in villages that were previously not electrified, and then when the grid finally arrives, they simply lift it and take it to a yet further remote area. So it means that in China, people no longer worry that if they accept decentralized renewables, they'll never get the grid, because they know there's a system in which it'll simply be moved, because these renewable energy technologies are very footloose, and it's possible to move them whenever it can be done. I think I'm out of time, and that's as much as I want to say. Thank you very much.